As more people are joining us, I just wanted to say thank you for signing on tonight for History Happy Hour, Juneteenth, the evolution of a holiday. We will get started shortly. We're just waiting for more folks to sign in with us. While we wait for more people to keep signing in, if you'd like to share with us during the program, you can ask questions in the Q&A, as well as drop some questions and comments in the chat box. I'll explain more about this later if you're not too familiar. But when you're talking in the chat, please make sure to change it to everyone and not just panelists, so that everyone can see your comments. So we have so much to talk about today, so I want to get started as it is now 5:30. So hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this evening for History Happy Hour, Juneteenth, the evolution of a holiday. I want to give a quick thank you to our sponsor for today's program, OneAmerica, and extra support provided by the Robin and Charlitta Winston Family Fund for African American History. So if you've driven by their building in downtown Indianapolis, you might know OneAmerica best for their witty signboard, signature rooftop flag, or outstanding corporate citizenship. But as the national provider of insurance and financial services for more than 140 years, the companies of OneAmerica help customers build and protect their financial futures. OneAmerica products include retirement plans, individual life insurance, annuities, long-term care solutions, and employee benefit plan products. Thank you, OneAmerica and the Robin and Charlitta Winston Family Fund for African American History for your continued support of the Indiana Historical Society and their mission. And thanks again for every one of you for joining us today. My name is Lauren Pachtel, and I serve as one of the managers of engagement at the Indiana Historical Society. It is great to have so many of you here this evening, and I will be going over a few logistics before passing the mic over to our speakers. At the Indiana Historical Society, we are Indiana Storyteller, connecting people to the past, and we collect paper-based items such as books, paintings, letters, photographs, diaries, maps, and more to tell Indiana's unique stories. We then find ways to share these stories through publications, exhibits, and events such as this. So through these documents, we tell the diverse stories of Indiana and inspire a future grounded in our state's uniting values and principles. Tonight, we're here for a conversation on memory, tradition, and the evolution of Juneteenth, from June 19th, 1865 in Galveston, Texas, to the work of activists like Opal Lee, to shift in recognition of this day to a state and federal holiday, and even today, including that Congress passed a bill yesterday and that President Biden signed this bill at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time today to make this a federal holiday, the first since Martin Luther King Jr. Day in 1983. But before I hand it over to our IHS staff colleague, Susan, I have a few pieces of logistics to go over. For this event, Susan and Sharon will talk for about 35 minutes, and then we'll open it up to your questions. If you have questions as we go along, please drop it in the question and answer section of your Zoom screen. We'll keep an eye on them and then pepper them in as we get to the second half of the program. If you would like to add anything to the chat box, don't forget to change your response to all panelists and attendees so that we can see all your thoughts. Keep an eye on the chat where I will be dropping in links and URLs throughout the conversation. Don't worry if you miss one. They will be delivered to your inbox in a follow-up email tomorrow morning. This program is being recorded, and you can catch the replay on our website, indianahistory.org, in the upcoming weeks. If you enjoy this program, consider coming back for more. Our History Happy Hours continue July 14th with How Did We Can, as we jump over to chat with historian LaDonna Garner and go to her canning shed for a conversation about heirloom foods and preservation. And sign up for that and more at indianahistory.org for more information about this and other virtual offerings coming to an internet-connected device near you. And so now I'm going to toss it over to Susan Hall Dotson, and we're going to get started with this wonderful conversation with Sharon.
Thank you, Lauren. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to History Happy Hour here at Indiana Historical Society. I'd like to thank our gracious speaker, Sharon Gillins, for joining us tonight to talk about why and how to celebrate Juneteenth. Today is a historic day that we get to do this on. As Lauren has already said, that President Biden signed into law that Juneteenth is federally recognized now as a holiday. It took from 1865 to 2021 for that to occur. And we'll kind of unpack that as we go in our conversation. But let's start with two things. I want to welcome everybody to Happy Hour. And since we're in Happy Hour, one of the things we always do is, what are you drinking today? So the thing that I'm drinking today I'm using I'm a member of the Lynx Incorporated. I got my great green and white Lynx cup, and no alcohol permitted on premises. So I am having Coke and ice. How about you, Sharon? What's your drink tonight?
I am drinking, let's see if I can get it in there where you can see it. I'm drinking coconut water, organic coconut water in my Sister Soul glass.
Cheers.
Cheers.
But before we move into that, I'd like
click those glasses.
Click. I'd like to do a symbolic pouring of the libations tonight.
Oh, wonderful.
For the ancestors. And we do that to remind ourselves and to remember them and embrace them for all they've been through and all they left us with. And stony the road they trod, and we are their wildest dreams come true. And there's still a long way to go, but again, libations for the ancestors.
Libations to the ancestors.
So before we get to next, I'd like to tell everybody out there a little bit about Sharon Gillins and what a pleasure this is tonight.
Thank you so much.
Sharon Gillins, a native of Galveston. So as we talk and learn more about Juneteenth, we are not just going to focus on what happens in Indiana, as we typically and traditionally do. We'll get a little bit about that in, but Juneteenth really is based in Texas. Why, we'll learn more about, but that is her native home. She has over 40 years of experience as an educator, historian, and over 25 years as a genealogical researcher. So this is a gem. So currently, she is a research associate, let me get this right, at Mary Moody Northern Endowment in Galveston. And she is responsible for the Moody family and business archives and manuscripts and photographs. And they date back to the 1800s. So she too is one of us. She understands the work that we do here at IHS, and as an educator, as a nationally recognized genealogy presenter at conferences around this country, she is more than able and capable of sharing the history and the stories with us, and I am grateful to learn more from you tonight. So tell us, we'll start with the premise that some people on this History Happy Hour don't know what Juneteenth is and when it started and where.
Well, thank you guys so much for having me. It is just wonderful that we get to chat about this on such an important day that the holiday becomes a national holiday. Of course, we in Galveston have been celebrating Juneteenth really since 1865. And Juneteenth is the celebration of emancipation. It is the day on June 19th, 1865, when Major General Gordon Granger arrived in Texas to enforce the emancipation of enslaved people here. Now, some people say they came to announce the emancipation and that people here didn't know. That is absolutely not true. People here knew that the enslaved people were free. It's just that Texas decided they would not respect that executive order, the Emancipation Proclamation. And it took them a while to send federal troops here to enforce the emancipation of enslaved people, over 250,000 of them. So why did they come to Galveston? Because at that time, Galveston was the New York of the South. It was the economic engine of the state. It was the most important city in the state because of the Deepwater port. Anything that was grown in the interior had to be brought to the coast in order to ship it out to the rest of the country and the world. So that's why they came here. So on June 19th, General Gordon Granger arrives with thousands of military troops, and among them were thousands of United States colored troops. And a lot of people are not aware that the United States colored troops came here to help to enforce emancipation for enslaved people. So you can imagine what a sight it was for enslaved people and also people who had lived under the system of enslavement or slavery for generations to see African men with military uniforms on and carrying weapons. It was quite a sight. And so when they got here, they headquartered at the Osterman building, and then they went and spread out throughout the city to notify the enslaved people that they had arrived. But they absolutely knew that they were free. It's just that the Confederates still had the guns. They were still in charge because the last battle was fought here in 1863, and the Confederates were still in charge. They won the battle. And so this territory was still Confederate territory. The enslaved people couldn't just walk away.
So when they came, when General Granger came, what reception, what pushback, what resistance was he and the other troops faced by the Confederacy?
They got no resistance. There was no resistance, and it was reported in the paper that there was no resistance. The Confederates knew that the war was won and that the Union had defeated the Confederacy. They were just waiting to have the troops come here and make them abide by it. There was absolutely no resistance whatsoever. No guns had to be pulled, no fights, nothing. The surrender had already taken place.
Interesting, because in some scholarly work, it's been suggested that the reason that people didn't know, the enslaved didn't know, was purposeful, to keep them working for free, and that potentially or possibly someone had been killed en route prior to Granger coming. Is there any validity to that story?
I have not been able to find any validity to that story. In fact, I did a newspaper search, and I did an article that's at the Prairie View and A&M University website called The Day Freedom Came. And in order to write that article, I researched newspapers of the day, and they were already in the newspapers weeks before talking about what's going to happen when Gordon Granger comes or when the military comes. What money are we going to use? Are we going to be able to return to using United States money, because they had been using Confederate money? They talked about the trains from Houston were packed, where people were returning back here to Galveston to start their businesses all over again. They absolutely knew. The newspapers were full of it. And if you know anything about enslaved people, they knew how to get information. They were in the room while they were talking about this stuff, and they definitely passed that news around among themselves. Everybody knew. So that is a rumor, and I've found nothing to document that.
Wow, and that rumor still exists.
It still
persists
exists
in some scholarly tomes today. So what was the initial reaction by the enslaved, who now had backing of a militia and a government to say you are free?
Jubilation. And that is why you hear the word jubilation used in association with Juneteenth. It was jubilo. They called it jubilo. So there was spontaneous celebrations right there on the docks where they came in. They didn't come in by horseback. They came in by ship from Mobile. And so the ship arrived in the port. You can't just drive a ship into the port without notification of that. There was information about the ship on the way. The ship's gonna arrive in the paper. So they knew the ship was coming. People met them on the docks. So there was spontaneous celebrations immediately on the docks when they arrived.
Did Granger then advance outside of the docks and go deeper into the town to make this announcement?
Yes. He was the general, so he would not have done it himself. He headquartered at the Osterman building at the corner of 22nd and Strand. There's a Juneteenth marker there now. And the building is no longer there, but there is a marker there. And then his troops went out to spread out throughout the city to inform the enslaved people that they had arrived. It is said, and we have no documentation of it, it's said that one of the places that they posted a notice about it was right here on the church door of Reedy Chapel AME Church. It would not have been this particular building, because the original building has burned down, but that starts the tradition at Reedy Chapel, that it was one of the first places that General Gordon Granger and his troops announced that they had arrived to enforce their freedom.
So as the now formerly enslaved are celebrating in jubilation, what are their now former owners doing?
They're trying to adjust. It was a new way of life. I mean, the first thing they had to get used to was seeing Black people with guns. And now that's pretty much what was in the paper. How are we going to adjust to this? What are we going to do? There was a lot of talk about those Black people will never be able to take care of themselves. They will never be able to do anything without our help. And so the whole mindset of everyone had to change. The actual on the ground could not change immediately, because if you think about it, they just basically released people and said, you are free. But what did that mean? They had never experienced that in generations of life. Generations of their ancestors did not know what that meant. They didn't give them 200 acres like they did the original settlers of Texas. They didn't give them, they never received that 40 acres and that mule. And so they had to, in many cases, stay where they were and continue to work. And in fact, General Order Number 3 advises the freedmen to remain at their present location and to work for wages, because now the relationship between the two would be that of employer and employee, no longer master and slave. So it was different, but it probably took quite a lot of time to make the adjustment. And in fact, if you think about it, we're still making the adjustment. We're still adjusting to that. And it's been 156 years.
Oh, yeah. That's particularly in, and we'll get to that, I guess, at some point, in non-slave states, that this Emancipation Proclamation did not extend to, if you will, because it was not a slave-bearing state.
That's a very true statement, and most people are unaware of that. It was applicable to only the states that were in rebellion against the United States, and those were the Confederate states.
Yeah,
so
11 states.
Right. So what it
and there were 3 slave states that were actually part of the Union: Delaware, Maryland, and West Virginia, which ceded at that moment from Virginia. That's how we get another state. So they were still slave-owning states, but technically, the emancipation didn't apply to them.
That's absolutely correct. That is correct. And so what about them? Well, it took an amendment to the Constitution to change that. And so our rights, the day of the Emancipation Proclamation was just the first step in our in granting equal rights to Africans in this country. They were not African Americans because they were not yet citizens. They took another constitutional amendment to make them citizens of the United States.
The 14th Amendment, and that's
exactly
loosely,
right.
And that's loosely too, for that matter. But so as I discussed earlier today, on how it affects Indiana as a non-slave state. So I won't say a free state. And we'll get to that. And I'll actually read a passage from the Constitution that says that. But how many African Americans today, but Africans, were affected in Texas, in Galveston, by that announcement? I think that's a pivotal thing, because sometimes we look at, through our modern day lens, at how many people were affected by that in that moment.
There were over 300,000 enslaved people in Texas. That's a huge number of people.
Yes.
You know, at that point, Texas was the western frontier of this United States, and it was not heavily populated except in the areas where enslaved people were, the cotton growing areas and along the ports, along the coastline where the ports were. So to have that number of people enslaved, and then to have them all released from enslavement at the same time, was quite a major adjustment in every way, Mm-hmm. And there you see the beginning of the sharecropping system. And I do a lot of research into the Freedmen's Bureau. And the Freedmen's Bureau had to sign labor contracts with the former enslavers and with the freedmen. So they had to now make that come into effect, that this is a wage relationship. And of course, the former owners said, we can't afford to pay wages. We're broke. Everything, our economy is busted, but we'll give you a share of the crop. And they signed agreements to that. These were people who lacked the reading and comprehension skills of legalese to understand what they were signing. And they signed themselves to contracts which they were working for a share of the crop. So since the enslavers were no longer responsible for the freedmen, they then made them pay for everything that they used, every piece of thread, every piece of cloth, and they kept an account of that. all the seeds, all the farm animals. They had to rent the implements for them to eke out their own living. And at the end of the year, it was not unusual for a person who's working on a share to owe more money to the owner than they could, that was their share of the crop. So they ended the year up in debt. So it was like a trick almost, you know.
Yeah.
It was like a trick.
Yeah. Yeah, and it was around for a very long time.
A very long time, very long time, very, very long time.
Well into Reconstruction and well past
well
it
beyond
through Jim
that.
Crow.
Well beyond that, into Jim Crow.
And if we had more time, we could go into convict leasing.
Oh my goodness, yes.
Peonage of slavery by another name that existed legally all the way until 1945, and some would suggest even today. But
and they made it legal by peonage and slave labor illegal by leaving it in the Constitution. It's still in there.
It's still in there today.
It's still in there
and
today.
For those who need just a little bit more information, I got it right here.
Amen.
That and this is the Indiana Constitution. Forget the United States, since we're in Indiana. And Article 11, Section 7 says, there shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in the state, otherwise than for the punishment of crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. So then we can get to lynching, how no due process and people are convicted and tried and executed. Another story too, but nor shall any indenture of any Negro or mulatto made and executed out of the bounds of the state be of any validity within the state. Table that for a little later. Let's shift gears a little bit to something more festive. Talk about the celebrations. What did they look like? What were the early ones like, and what has been retained and maintained from Galveston outward throughout the nation? And what have other places and spaces added to the celebration to make it their own? Because they too were in jubilation throughout the South. And then people in northern states and non-slaveholding states were in jubilation because so many came from there and their families and relatives, and just people from the diaspora in the Americas understood that if no one is free until we are all free.
We're all free.
So,
okay. Well, the very first citywide celebration of emancipation, and this is documented, took place on January 1st, 1866. This was the effective date of the Emancipation Proclamation, was January 1st, 1863. And so on December 31st, 1865, a notice appeared in a Galveston paper that there would be a celebration held to celebrate the emancipation of formerly enslaved people, and that it would consist of a march from the old Galveston courthouse to the Colored Church on Broadway. That Colored Church on Broadway was Reedy Chapel AME Church. And when they got to the church, then they went inside and did a program that consisted of inspirational speeches and music and encouraging words delivered by military personnel and others in the city. And so we, as members of Reedy Chapel AME Church, we reenact that celebration every year with that march from the old Galveston courthouse to Reedy Chapel. This is what Reedy Chapel looks like now. The other, the first church was, of course, a lot less grand, but we still celebrate it in that way. And in the beginning, it was a lot more serious. As I read through papers, there was a lot more reflection and education involved. And we try to hold on to that education part and make sure that people understand why we are celebrating. And over the years, it evolved into more celebratory with gatherings of people. People would come back from other places, like for homecoming, and celebrate at home. This is the flyer that we are having for our Juneteenth celebration this year. And you can see my favorite t-shirt is up in the corner. It says Juneteenth Celebrate. And this is the 156th celebration of emancipation. Our special guest is Miss Opal Lee, grandmother of Juneteenth. And she was just here a couple of weeks ago to complete that 2.5-mile march that symbolizes the 2.5 years that enslaved people waited for their emancipation to be enforced here. So every celebration by African Americans includes music and food. Now that's just basics. That's just the basics. And then homecoming. And in fact, we still have homecomings and family reunions held on the weekends of Juneteenth. And so bringing back the family was definitely part of it, and eating great barbecue. We eat a lot of the African plum. The African plum is what we call watermelon. It was a staple. Some of the best watermelons in the country are grown right here in Texas. And so it was just something that we loved. And also, whereas soda, which we call soda water, is, there's no big thing now. It was a big thing back then to have red soda water. And so red soda water, barbecue, and watermelon, that was a staple. And then of course, all the fixings, the potato salad and all of that. And as people from Galveston migrated out to other parts of the country, they took those traditions with them. And that's how it spread throughout the country. There was a period of time when the celebrations waned and they weren't as robust here as they were in the beginning. I'd say somewhere around the 50s and 60s, and then it came back up in the 70s with more awareness of African American history. And during that period of time, I think it grew in importance in other parts of the country. I went to school in Washington, D.C., and I was shocked at the beauty of and the grandeur of the celebrations that they had in D.C. We always had here in Texas, we would always go to the beach and take a whole day and be at the beach. That's what we did. Or we would go to the park. We'd have a whole day at the park. But our parks are right there on the beach. So it always included the beach.
Okay. Tell me a little bit more about the red soda pop. I mean, I've read a couple of different books about it, and it said that nobody knows exactly what that drink was in any things that I've read. So now I know one of the reasons why: Tahitian treat, red Kool-Aid, the sweeter, the redder, I'm happy. What do you think, or what do you know that it was actually made of?
I can't speculate on what the original ones were, but when we were growing up, it was knee-high red soda. Okay. It was knee-high. And that was our preferred red drink, So, I mean, I can only speculate that if you had carbonated anything, it was later in time. I don't think that in the 1800s there would have been carbonated anything. But then there might have been sorrel. Sorrel is a hibiscus, red hibiscus flower that makes a delicious drink that really is what Kool-Aid wants to be.
Yeah. And some have suggested strawberries.
It's possible.
And that would have been June is strawberry season.
Yes.
Still going on.
That's all very possible. And you know, that is a great question. And I just have been enjoying a wonderful series on Netflix called High on the Hog.
Yes,
That
me too.
is a wonderful series. And if you look at the last episode called Freedom, we're all over it. That's our march that they're showing. I'm in it. All my friends are in it. The church is in it. So you got to see High on the Hog. All of the episodes are wonderfully informative and entertaining, but we did not expect, I did not expect when I watched that episode, I looked at that t-shirt, I said, wait a minute, that's me.
There you go.
So
well, since
really
you brought up the
time.
t-shirt, I haven't got to the last 2 episodes. I'm 2 in and 2 to go. And 2 things, my daughter's on a camping trip and she bought a pot so she could make the okra soup. And she's out there with her doggy and she's got her shrimp and her okra. And my family is originally from South Carolina. So I was like, go get your geechee on. So I was really proud of her. And she sent me pictures. And so here she is in her 20s, carrying on, and she just watched High on the Hog, but she's been eating the stuff that we make that includes most of what you just said. But you brought up the t-shirt. We do have a question from the chat. Someone wants to know where they can purchase one.
Well, you know, this is actually a fundraiser for Reedy Chapel AME Church. Okay. And these shirts have been flying away. I've had 3 different orders placed for these shirts. So at this point, we are just taking orders for them in the future. So if you would like one, we are accepting orders. I'm going to stand up just a minute so you can see that whole t-shirt because I love this t-shirt.
That's great.
That's my favorite t-shirt, and it has been so very popular.
Well, if you can send in a chat or text to Lauren how they should go about placing an order, or put it in the chat and we'll send it to Sharon and go from there. How to reach you, what size, how many, and be part of the fundraiser for Reedy Chapel.
Thank you. And we have a way that you can just text in your payment. You don't have to send me money. There's a way, and I'll put all that information in there. The most important information is so I can collect those sizes, and you know, I have to add shipping, of course, but this, I know this shirt is unique and it's my design.
I'm reading one of the chats and someone mentioned the states that did not cede, and that is true. He mentioned that there were Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, but Kentucky and Missouri were not part of the Union, unlike Delaware, Maryland, and then West Virginia, who stayed slave states. So it's real complex and complicated, and thank you, Joseph, for that. That it's not just that simple. It's not just that, you know, President Lincoln came president in 1860, and by 1863, he freed the slaves and all was well with the world. So this is a good time to kind of segue, because Sharon has lived in different parts of the country and not just Texas. I'm from the East Coast and lived in the Midwest. And here in Indiana, although this was not a non-slave state, in 1831, the Blacks that were living here were made to pay a bond and register. And we have these registers, copies here, and original bound volumes in the state archives, as well as some local county archives. And so as not to become vagrants or burdensome on the state, they had to register, and it clearly will say their name, an N for Negro, an M for mulatto, their age, and any physical description that they felt was important, like has a mole on their cheek and a scar on their forehead. It got that detailed in some cases, but it goes into 1851. So for those who are wondering, why is Juneteenth important to the rest of the country, as well as to Indiana specifically, In 1851, the Indiana Constitution was amended. And one of the most important amendments that came from that was Article 13. And I'll read it verbatim. And it says, no Negro or mulatto shall come into the state after the adoption of this Constitution. Flat out, can't come here, not welcome here. The original NIMBY, not in my backyard and not my neighbor and not in my state. And it's been suggested that the reason for that was to counter and avoid having to deal with the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. But I posit that it was from other readings to make this a entirely white state as much as possible, since there was in 1831, you had to register and all these other reasons to keep you from here. Blacks could not engage in legal defense for or against themselves or others. And included in this, could not be part of the militia. No Negro mulatto shall have the right of suffrage. That was Article 2. And all of the additional articles that pertain to the life and citizenship, if you will, of Blacks living in Indiana were voted on separate from some additional articles that were amended in 1851. So when Juneteenth comes about and the proclamation in 1863, this is not about Indiana. It's not about New York. It's not about New Jersey. It's not about Connecticut, because they're not slave-bearing and slave-holding states. So it, in and of itself, it did not grant citizenship, equality, suffrage to the Blacks that lived within the states or wanted to come. But because of Juneteenth, then we get the 13th and the 14th and the 15th Amendments. The state then eventually, and not immediately, gets in line with the national amendments that then allow Blacks to come into the state, to reside in the state fully, for the Black men to have suffrage, because as we all know, women did not get suffrage until 1920.
Yes.
Could enter into contracts and land. So there's a lot of that. So that's why Juneteenth is important nationally and regionally, and right here in Indiana, because without that having occurred, that 1851 Article 13 may still exist, may have continued to exist. And that said, and it was sometimes not enforced, but it was enforceable. And there's evidence and legal statutes where people were sent packing when they came. And we don't have time to get into details of who and what they are, but it did occur here. And then those who did come or those who did stay were always under threat of being told they had to leave their land, leave their family, leave the job that they had. So here we are, Juneteenth.
Been an evolution. It's been an evolution. Yes. And so people question, well, why is Juneteenth the day? Because some people found their freedom out other days, because this is the day that our ancestors chose to celebrate emancipation, in the same way that some people, and this is how I've heard it described this way, and I think it's a perfect description. My friend Sam Collins, I heard him say this. He said that on Memorial Day, we celebrate all the people who were killed in military action. They weren't all killed on May 30th, but that was the day that was chosen for us to recognize and remember them. Everybody didn't achieve their freedom on June 19th, but that was the day that our ancestors said, we're going to celebrate that on June 19th, because those people down in Texas, they were the last ones to know. And so now that we're all officially free of, in the Confederate States, this is the day we're going to celebrate. And so that is the day that our ancestors chose to continue to celebrate and to carry that celebration out throughout the country and even out throughout the world. Because we've migrated, we've left here and we've gone and we've taken our traditions, our food traditions, our holidays out into where we migrated to. So we went to Chicago and made a little nest of people and they started celebrating, and then it got hold. And so that is just how it got spread throughout the country.
Absolutely. I'm going to shift gears to some questions, and let's see what we got here. We got the shirts. Check, check. That's the most important one, I think. Somebody said, now this is an interesting question. Where can I find information about the history of Black Americans that's not tainted by racism and whitewashing? Huh, that's a big one.
You have to research primary sources and write it, you know, and that's what archivists like Susan are doing. They are documenting our own history. Your history begins in your family. If you document your family's history and you know what your family went through within the context of this country, now you are changing history and learning what actually happened. You know, so there's no one source I can tell you to go through, but I think you should be a critical reader and seek out those original sources that are not altered by those who want to change the narrative. We have been completely left out of the narrative on purpose. The Daughters of the Confederacy after the Civil War went around and they got on every school board and they built statues and they changed the narrative to make their ancestors the heroes of the Civil War. And it stuck because they changed the minds of a new generation. Pay attention to what your children know. Children are unaware of what slavery is because it's been removed from their school. I grew up here in Galveston. I was in the high school here. I graduated with honors from a high school here in Galveston. I knew we celebrated Juneteenth, but the facts of Juneteenth I have gathered as an adult living in other parts of the country and having an interest in history, and then becoming familiar with how to research archival materials. Archival means nobody has changed them. They are how they were when they were created. And that's where you can really learn the facts and you can interpret them yourself.
And there are lots of books. I mean, some are old tomes, if you will, and like Beyond the Mayflower, Lerone Bennett. Then there are newer books that are out, too many for me to name off the top of my head. I wish I had them sitting here, but I do. There are lots that you can find out there, and look to see Howard Zinn books. I mean, he has been telling the story and telling it plain about slavery and the peculiar institution that it is. It's not just this little simple white people own black people. It's so much more to that. And to learn about the slave trade and what happened on transatlantic voyages, what happened when that was outlawed, what happened when that was outlawed and it was still happening, and then the intra-state trade that wasn't coming from abroad, from Africa or the Americas, and was going on for quite some time. The National Museum of African American History in Washington, D.C., the Memorial for Peace and Justice in the museum in Montgomery, to just name two. Come here and look at some of these books that I have fallen down the well and can't get out on. And there are plenty more, and documents that talk about, you know, the articles that I just read to you are not my interpretation or someone else's interpretation. They are just the articles from the Constitution.
Exactly.
They're just black and white, and they're really actually pretty short and to the point. One sentence. not here, pretty much. That is my paraphrase of Article 13. So come dive in the boxes all over the country. There are archives everywhere. Someone asked about the flag. Tell us more about the Juneteenth, the development of the Juneteenth flag.
You know, I am not fully aware of the details of that. However,
Okay.
I know what it looks like, and
Mhm.
I'm gonna try to share what I know. I know that there's a horizon, and it symbolizes something, and then there's a star, but there's a multi-point star, and it's hanging out front right now. I just need to go ahead and know all the details of that. So Susan, educate me.
I don't know all the details either. I have looked it up for a previous presentation. But what I will say about the flag that I find the most interesting, as I look at your shirt, and from where we started and to where we've gone, and the emergence of Pan-Africanism and the effects that it has had for, say, the late 1800s and the early 1900s, of the red, black, and green flag, red, black, and gold, of which your shirt represents. But the Juneteenth flag is red, white, and blue.
Yes, it is. And that
Because
was chosen for that.
Yes, the people who were celebrating in jubilation were from the African continent, but had been here for so many generations and hundreds
They
of
were
years. Americans who were not afforded the rights and privileges and citizenship as Americans. And so it's quite interesting. Now, in hindsight, I did make a slide that we don't have with us right now. I don't know if I can pull it up fast enough, that shows the 34 stars for all of the United States at the time, the red, white, and blue flag of the Confederacy, and then the red, white, and blue flag. And they all have the same elements: red, white, blue, stars, and the big stripe. There you go. Thank you. So it's in, you don't think about it necessarily in modern moment that those who created that were saying, we're not going back, as the colonization movement suggested and was trying to push people to go to the American colony of Liberia. We are here. We have lived, married, birthed children, died generation after generation, and worked and toiled.
This country and built it.
Yep. And worked and toiled and built this.
Imagine
and we are staying.
And we're staying.
And the flag wasn't to represent another nation, but to represent this freedom. As I said earlier, if we only could be free if we're all free. So instead of counting stars, it's kind of interesting. No counting stars. It's one star, one red stripe, one blue stripe. And we're in an imperfect world, in an imperfect space, and we're still working to get that cohesion and cohesiveness and equity and equality, not for one, but for all.
And I think, Susan, I agree with you. And I think it starts with knowing what really happened. The narrative has been so altered that people are so many people are very much unaware of the facts of our historical past. And it's a shared historical past, but the historical past has not reflected all of us who are here. And this does not just apply to African Americans, it applies to Hispanics and people of Asian descent. People of other cultures are not reflected either. in the historical narrative. It's been written from the point of view of one ethnicity, and we have suffered for that. Because if you don't know that this ethnicity has made these wonderful contributions to society, and if you don't know that they are out there right now today, creating beautiful works of art and making contributions to science and technology and education, math, if you don't know that, then it's easy to think their lives don't matter. They're not doing anything. So that's why it's important for everybody to know what the facts of history are, and that African Americans have made contributions to this country from the moment they arrived until this second that we are sitting here today.
Mhm. I was thinking as we kind of segue out of this about the high on the hog and the episode about okra and where okra actually comes from.
Yes.
So anybody who's on this History Happy Hour who likes gumbo or fried okra, it came with the folks. It came with the people on the ships from the continent of Africa. And then it was harvested and cooked, and it's rough and tough. It's a very resilient vegetable that doesn't grow everywhere, at least at that time that it first arrived, but it still sustained itself. And we take for granted, what are those things? And even the stereotype of Blacks and watermelon, they're really in the community. Make fun if you like, but that's what we've been growing. And that too came from the continent as well. So as we learn how to eat, play, and celebrate together, do you have any words of advice for those who want to celebrate along with African Americans? That question has come up. What's the best way to acknowledge and celebrate Juneteenth too?
In the same way we do. It's about freedom. It's a celebration of freedom. Wherever Juneteenth is being celebrated, get thee to that place and celebrate right along with us. We don't think of this as a celebration just for African Americans. We are so joyful that now it's a celebration that's recognized by the United States. It took 56 years for it to happen, but it has happened. And so that legitimizes it to the general public that it is a celebration that should be recognized by everyone in the United States, since our Constitution is based on freedom and equality. Juneteenth blew up in Galveston this year in many ways because of this mural that's being dedicated on Juneteenth. It's called Absolute Equality. And this beautiful mural, and the profile that you see is the profile of the side of a building. It is 5,000 square feet of mural.
Wow.
And it's standing on the border of the location where the Osterman building was located and the Juneteenth marker is located. And it really tells the story of Africans when they first arrived in this country up until now and into the future. And we're saying here, we're going into space, and don't take that bad behavior with you, because there might be some people out there who are different from us. And we want them to know that they are going to have absolute equality too. This mural is phenomenal for many reasons. One reason is that it has a segment of it, the walls can talk. It has augmented reality built into it with QR codes. If you point your phone at different one of these circles there, it tells the story of what's going on in that circle. And we have embedded QR codes in historical sites throughout the city, where you can take your phone, take your kid, take the kid's phone and point it at the site right here at Reedy Chapel. And it will tell you, it will go to a video interview with individuals about that site so you can learn about it. And so this mural is being dedicated. It was drawn, it was painted by a muralist. His name is Reginald C. Adams, and a team of creatives. It was conceived by a young man whose name is Samuel Collins III. He has been a tireless historian, and I'm so proud of how he has just taken the initiative to get these things done. He just pulled together a coalition of people to do this mural, and it has just exploded. It is everywhere. I have people calling me from everywhere about Juneteenth who've never called before. So I'm sure that this weekend is just going to be off the chain. We're having the dedication of the mural. Of course, we have the virtual celebration for Reedy. We have the actual Emancipation March. There's a parade, there's fireworks, there's a festival, and there are historical talks. And so whatever your interest is, you can find something of interest. And while celebrations in other cities may not be as grand as this one is right now, this year, I'm sure there are celebrations in other places. The fact that you're here on this call, you're celebrating emancipation with us. You are part of the celebration now because you're here celebrating it with us.
Well, thank you so much, Sharon. It's been a joy and a pleasure to sit and talk with you tonight. We can sit and talk about this and so much more until tomorrow night. And I look forward to doing that again as well. But for those who don't know, who are here in Indiana, Indianapolis area, we will be at Riverside Park at the festival celebrating Juneteenth. There's a lot of stuff going on around this town. Some have already taken place. And in other cities that I know of as well, some very big ones. And so this new national holiday is kind of, they're just catching up with what everybody else has already been doing and what everybody already knew about. And for those who don't know, well, now you do, and welcome. Welcome and come and celebrate with us, and come visit us here at the Indiana Historical Society in the archives and the library. And I'm going to turn it over to Lauren.
Thank you so much, Sharon and Susan, for this great conversation. We have so many people commenting about how much they learned, and it was a great conversation. I don't think we could have ever timed this or any other program we do.
This was great. It was the best.
Yes, exactly. We so appreciate you both taking the time to talk about the history and evolution of Juneteenth with us tonight. We all know this conversation could have gone on for hours and hours, but thank you for hanging out with us for the last hour as we continue to move into Juneteenth on Saturday. And thank you again to our sponsor, OneAmerica, and with support from the Robin and Charlitta Winston Family Fund for African American History. And thanks to each and every one of you for joining us tonight on this day of living history for the evolution of Juneteenth as a federal holiday. About time.
And I have enjoyed this program, to say, Happy Juneteenth. Go tell somebody. Go tell somebody.
Yes, exactly. But if you enjoyed this program, we hope you'll consider coming back for more. And as I mentioned at the top of the program, we have more History Happy Hours coming soon. Check back in with us for July 14th for How Did We Can? And stay tuned for more upcoming conversations. Catch us on Facebook Live Wednesday, June 23rd at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for more info from Susan Hall Dotson and archivist Mary Gervitz about the life and times of Ruth MacArthur and the MacArthur Conservatory, talking about Black Music Month. And join us on Tuesday, July 6th for a conversation around immigration and the changing story of America at our research roundtable, hosted by IHS with the Genealogy Center at Allen County Public Library. Sign up for these and even more virtual offerings coming to an internet-connected device near you at www.hscc.org. indianahistory.org and check out the calendar. I will drop that in the chat. We'll post this conversation to the IHS YouTube channel and our website in the upcoming weeks. But in the meantime, if you'd like to revisit any of our previous free programs, you can check out the History Happy Hour playlist on YouTube or at the link in the chat. I've shared a few times and I can share again. But if you missed your chance to donate or would like to make a further gift to support the Indiana Historical Society, please go to indianahistory.org, contribute and donate. And your donation will allow us to continue to share Hoosiers stories. You will get an email from us tomorrow morning with all these links and a survey, and it'll take around a minute, but we'd love to know what you thought and how we can make programs like this even better. Thank you. Stay safe. And we'd love to know what you thought and how we can make and see you in the future. Thanks, everyone.
Clear?